Hey there! Tonight, we're not curling up with tales of queens or cathedrals or heroic speeches echoing through time. Number tonight, we're doing something a little stickier, a little squishier. Something your stomach might question, even as your eyelids drift shut. Because this time, we're sinking into the dim, smelly corridors of history's medical past. Not the sanitized kind they show in museums, but the real kind, packed with pus, leeches, smoke, and sawdust. We're talking about the truly disgusting medical treatments people once swore by. The ones that made people scream, faint, or just politely die. So go ahead, dim your lights, maybe light a candle if you like that kind of thing, or turn on a soft fan, the kind that hums just enough to drown out the sound of imaginary bone saws. If this kind of quiet, grounded storytelling helps you relax, you're welcome to like the video or subscribe, but only if it genuinely brings you peace. And hey, leave a comment letting me know where you're listening from and what time it is. I always love seeing how far these weird little journeys travel. Now, take a slow breath. Try not to think too hard about what that smell might be. And let's begin. Because once upon a time, if you were sick, truly sick, you didn't go to the hospital, you went to the barber. And that, unfortunately, was just the beginning. You're sitting in a chair that doesn't feel entirely clean. There's a basin near your feet, not because they expect you to vomit, but because the next person probably will. A man in a blood-streaked apron is tying a leather strap around your arm, not to comfort you, but to keep you still. And beside him is a table with tools, some of which wouldn't look out of place in a blacksmith's forge. This is medieval medicine, and the first treatment up for tonight, bloodletting. The idea was simple, if horrifying. People believed that illness came from an imbalance of humours, 4 fluids that governed your entire existence: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. And if you had too much of one, say blood, the obvious answer was to get rid of it. Doctors, or more often, barbers, would open a vein and let you bleed into a bowl until your complexion lightened, or your eyes rolled back, or you simply passed out. In some cases, they didn't even bother with veins. They'd used leeches instead. Slimy, writhing little creatures placed carefully on your arms, legs, or even inside your mouth. Leeches were particularly fashionable. They were considered natural surgeons, and people paid good money for them. Of course, nobody really considered that a leech didn't care if it was draining excess humour or just making you dangerously anemic. It just sucked. And then there was the cupping. Glass cups heated with fire, then slapped onto your back to create suction. The skin would rise like a dome inside the glass. If that wasn't horrifying enough, some versions of cupping involved cutting the skin first, so that blood would be drawn out into the cup in thick, warm streams. They called it purification. You might call it something else. But if you managed to survive the bleeding, the next step might be a nice dose of mercury. Yes, mercury. The silvery metal that now comes with warnings and hazmat suits. It was once the miracle cure of choice for everything from syphilis to melancholy. Doctors would smear it on your skin, or boil it into steam and make you sit in a box and inhale the fumes. In especially advanced cases, they'd administer it as a drink, a thick, metallic sip of madness. Because mercury doesn't just sit in the body. It invades the nerves, it rots the teeth, it makes the skin peel. It twists your thoughts and burns your stomach, and eventually, if you're lucky, it kills you before the full madness sets in. But the logic was there. If disease came from within, maybe poisoning the body was the way to chase it out. Which brings us to the next lovely invention, trepanation. This one's old, like really old. We're talking Stone Age old. The idea was to cure mental illness, epilepsy, or mysterious headaches by drilling a hole in the skull. Just a little one. Just enough to release the spirits or equalize pressure. They didn't have anesthesia. What they did have were sharp stones, bone saws, and a shocking amount of determination. Archaeological remains show that some people actually survived this. Skull bones with smooth edges suggest healing occurred. But how many died in the process? Hard to say. In many cultures, trepanned skulls were considered valuable, passed down, displayed, perhaps as proof of bravery, or maybe just as a warning. If having a hole in your head wasn't enough, you might have been prescribed a lovely poultice of cow dung. Yes, animal waste, rubbed directly into wounds. Why? Because dung was warm, and in some traditions, sacred. It also had a pleasant texture if mixed with herbs. Never mind the bacteria, never mind the stench. It was considered earthy medicine, drawing out infection through natural channels. Of course, in most cases, what it actually did was introduce more infection, which meant fever, which meant delirium, which meant they'd bleed you again, or perhaps offer you another delightful cure, burning the wound with a hot iron. Cauterization. Imagine the hiss, the scream, the smell of your own flesh sealing shut under fire. They thought it stopped poison from spreading. And to be fair, sometimes it did. It also stopped everything else, like nerve function or circulation. But in an age with no antibiotics and no antiseptics, cautery was considered bold and brave, a mark of the truly healed. Meanwhile, if your problem wasn't physical but emotional, say you were a woman experiencing anxiety or nervous fits, you might have been diagnosed with hysteria. And the treatment? Vibration? Doctors believed that hysteria was caused by a wandering womb. That's not a metaphor. They literally thought the uterus could roam the body, like a lost animal, causing trouble wherever it went. So the cure was to return it to its proper place. This involved massages, elaborate rituals, later machines. The earliest vibrators were created not for pleasure, but for medical use. Large, cranking devices meant to calm the patient. By the late 1800s, this became so common that some doctors complained of wrist fatigue. Clinics specializing in hysteria treatment emerged. It was only later that the true implications were, let's say, more widely understood. But the medical establishment held firm. If it worked, it was science. And if hysteria was too far gone, they might recommend smelling salts. Or failing that, lobotomy, cutting connections in the brain to cure behaviour. A small ice pick, a flick of the wrist. No more tantrums, no more thoughts either, but calm, quiet compliance. Some people smiled afterwards, many did not. And through it all, through the bleeding, burning, drilling and poisoning, patients did what humans have always done. They endured, they trusted, they hoped. Because even if the cure was worse than the disease, it was still a cure. It was still a chance. It was still medicine. Even if it came from the edge of a rusty blade or the belly of a leech. The leech is full now. Fat and glistening, it wriggles lazily before being tossed aside. Sometimes into a jar to be reused, sometimes crushed underfoot like it never mattered. You're pale, dizzy, and not entirely convinced anything has improved. But the doctor nods approvingly. You're lighter, he says. Clearer. You're welcome. But what if your problem isn't blood or bile or demons? What if it's just a tooth? Toothaches were among the most dreaded afflictions of the pre-modern world, not because they were fatal necessarily, but because of what it took to get rid of them. No numbing gel, no quiet drill with a little light, no sterile gloves and soft music. No, you'd sit in a chair that smelled like old meat, brace your hands against your thighs, and hope the barber surgeon's grip was stronger than your jaw. Tooth extractions were done with iron pincers, or in some cases with a device called a tooth key, an instrument resembling a door key designed to hook under the tooth and twist it out with a sudden, brutal motion. One wrong angle and the tooth might shatter. Or worse, your jaw might fracture. Infections were common. Shock, even more so. But there was good news, sort of. Before the extraction, they might offer you a drink. It wouldn't numb the pain, but it might make you too drunk to scream properly. Alcohol, of course, was the world's first anaesthetic. Not because it worked well, but because it was often all there was. Whiskey, brandy, beer, anything that dulled the senses was fair game. Some patients were given opium, if they were lucky. Laudanum, in particular, a tincture of opium dissolved in alcohol, became a go-to remedy for pain, anxiety, insomnia, grief, indigestion, and general malaise. It was sold over the counter, sometimes sweetened with honey or mixed into syrups for children. And for a while it seemed like a miracle, until people realised they couldn't stop taking it, until babies started slipping away in their cribs, quiet and still, until addicts filled asylums, gaunt and glassy-eyed, still clutching their little bottles, but even that was considered cleaner than some other options. In Renaissance Europe, for instance, a particularly fashionable cure for epilepsy involved drinking the blood of a freshly executed criminal. It had to be fresh, still warm ideally. Spectators at executions would crowd forward, not just for the spectacle, but for the chance to catch the blood in a cup and sip it before it cooled. It wasn't seen as grotesque, it was medicinal. The idea was that the vitality of the recently deceased could transfer into the living, that their spirit, or at least their strength, might inhabit your body and banish the convulsions. Other parts of the corpse were prized too. Powdered mummy, imported from Egypt, was ground into fine dust and mixed with wine as a remedy for various ailments. It was thought to contain powerful ancient energy. Never mind that the trade was fraudulent, or that the mummies were often not royal, but random bodies soaked in bitumen. It sold, it soothed. It made the user feel potent. Meanwhile, in other parts of Europe, the recommended treatment for a persistent cough was boiled fox lungs. Yes, fox lungs. Dried, crushed, and stewed into a bitter broth, sometimes mixed with herbs and honey to mask the taste. Foxes, it was believed, had sharp, clever lungs, perfect for clearing the airways of the sick. Other animals weren't safe either. Bats, snakes, lizards. If it could be caught, it could be cooked. And if it could be cooked, someone somewhere believed it could cure you. Of course, not every treatment involved eating or bleeding. Some were ritualistic. Take urine therapy. From ancient Rome to Victorian England, human urine was considered a versatile medical fluid. It was used to clean wounds, whiten teeth, soothe stings, and wash infected skin. People bathed in it, gargled with it. In some cases they drank it, not always their own. The idea, again, was rooted in balance. Urine was a byproduct of the body, a filtered essence, and thus it was believed to contain healing properties. Of course, modern science disagrees, but for centuries it was considered not just acceptable, but respectable. In ancient China, child urine, specifically from boys under a certain age, was collected for traditional remedies. In Europe, urine-soaked cloths were wrapped around the feet to draw out fever. And if a cut was particularly nasty, pouring urine on it was considered cleaner than water from the nearest stream. Which brings us inevitably to fecal medicine. Yes, it's not just a modern probiotic idea. Ancient and medieval healers experimented with the medicinal use of feces in a variety of horrifying ways. In some cases, animal dung was smeared on wounds to absorb toxins. In others, mixtures were brewed and strained, then administered rectally as an enema. The idea of transplanting healthy waste into the body wasn't entirely wrong. In fact, modern science now uses fecal transplants in extreme cases of intestinal infection. But centuries ago, the process wasn't guided by microbiology. It was guided by guesswork and a terrifying amount of enthusiasm. Imagine lying on your side, shivering with fever, while a healer, possibly drunk, definitely unwashed, prepares a goat dung and milk infusion. Then imagine them whispering something about balance and harmony before applying it where the sun doesn't shine. It's not a fantasy, it's a documented method. And it wasn't even the worst one, because if your body was weak from long-term illness and the standard purges and bleedings had failed, some doctors had a more aggressive solution. They'd place you in a barrel. Not metaphorically, literally. You'd be stripped, smeared with ointments, sometimes animal fat, sometimes herbal poultices, and sealed into a wooden tub. Just your head poking out. Then they'd light a fire underneath. This was called a sweat cure. The idea was to boil the sickness out of you. Through sweat. Through steam. Through sheer willpower. You'd sit there for hours. Muscles trembling. Skin blistering. Breathing smoke and wondering if the end was near. In many cases it was. And if the sickness didn't kill you, the cure might. The irony was never lost on the patient, but it was very much lost on the physician. In fact, some doctors believed that suffering itself was part of the process. That pain purified, that agony revealed the will to live. So they designed treatments that didn't just fix the body, they tested the soul. Blistering, for instance. A process where special pastes were applied to the skin to deliberately create sores. These blisters were then harvested or drained with the belief that illness would escape through them. The more painful the blister, the more effective the treatment. It was a badge of honour to walk around covered in these oozing welts. It meant you were brave. It meant you had fought your own humours and won. Or at least you were still upright. And if not, if your legs had given out, if your thoughts wandered too far into dark places, then the final step might be a visit to the asylum. But not the clean, sterile spaces of modern mental health clinics. These were stone chambers with barred windows, straw on the floors, chains on the walls, and smells that never entirely left your clothes. Patients were subjected to cold water baths, sudden dousing in ice, isolation in dark rooms for days, rotating chairs that spun until the mind snapped free, or electroshock therapy in its crudest, earliest forms. No sedation, no explanation, just a jolt, and then silence. And when the silence didn't fix you, they'd reach for something more dramatic. Surgical removal of body parts believed to house madness, dental extractions, tonsil removal. Even parts of the colon or ovaries were taken under the theory that hysteria or melancholia was rooted in some rotting organ. These were not criminals. These were just sick people. People like us. People with dreams. With aches that had no name. With pain that medicine didn't understand. And in the face of that mystery, doctors reached for whatever they could. Bone saws, blistering pastes, buckets of leeches, bottles of mercury, because they were afraid. Just like the patients. Just like we would be. Afraid of what they couldn't fix, and desperate to believe they could. There's a breeze outside the stone walls now, so you can't feel it, but you can hear it. Soft, like the flap of fabric on a drying line. Inside, the room is still. The doctor is gone. The basin is empty. But the smell remains. Not rot exactly. Not even blood. Something older. Bitter. Astringent. Like crushed herbs that should have stayed in the ground. It's probably the theriac, a thick, black, molasses-like mixture of more than 60 ingredients. Theriac was once the most prized medicine in the world. Its recipe dated back to the ancient Greeks, but it was refined, if that's the word, by the Romans, the Byzantines, and eventually the physicians of medieval Europe and the Islamic Golden Age. Inside it, everything: opium, viper flesh, cinnamon, honey, wine, frankincense, myrrh, and a dozen other things you wouldn't feed to your worst enemy. Boiled down, fermented, aged for years in some cases, then swallowed by the spoonful or rubbed onto sores. It was believed to cure everything from plague to poison to indigestion. Royal apothecaries guarded their recipes like state secrets. Kings kept jars of it in silver cabinets. Merchants sold it at prices that would make your nose bleed. And if it didn't work, well, maybe you hadn't taken enough. But theriac wasn't alone in its ambition. There was also bezoar, a word that sounds like a fairy tale curse, and in some ways it was. A bezoar is a hard mass, an undigested lump of hair, plant fibre, or stone found in the stomach of an animal, usually a goat. Once discovered, it was cut out, polished, and treasured, because it was believed to be an antidote to all poisons. Royalty across Europe and Asia carried bezoars in pouches or mounted them in ornate rings. If someone suspected they'd been poisoned, a common worry for nobles with too many enemies, they would drop the bezoar into their wine and wait. If the stone fizzed or changed colour, the drink was considered dangerous. Sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't. Either way, the belief persisted for centuries. But what if poison did enter your body? Then, perhaps, you'd be given a live frog, not to kiss, to press against the infected area. Folk healers believed that frogs could draw out disease, that their cold, slimy bodies were like little sponges for suffering. If you had a sore throat, you might be told to hold a frog in your mouth, alive, until it stopped wriggling. The idea was that the frog would absorb the illness and die in your place. Charming. And if that didn't work, there were other things to put in your mouth, like sulphur, or arsenic, or ground up emeralds. Emeralds, yes. Precious stones weren't just for crowns and rings. They were powdered, mixed with vinegar or honey, and swallowed. Sometimes as a treatment for epilepsy, sometimes for nausea. Occasionally just because a wealthy patient believed they should sparkle on the inside too. The logic behind gem therapy was vague at best. Some said the stones vibrated at healing frequencies. Others believed they carried the concentrated energy of the earth. Either way, many a stomach ulcer owes its origins to a teaspoon of crushed luxury. Meanwhile, on another continent, indigenous cultures had their own cures. Some wise, some wildly misinterpreted by European observers. In parts of Mesoamerica, for example, hot chili peppers were used to treat respiratory infections. Smoke from burning peppers was inhaled through the nose to clear blockages and kill bacteria. It worked in its way, but it also made your eyes water, your lungs seize, and your sinuses scream. Colonial doctors saw the ritual, and misunderstanding it entirely, tried to replicate the results by instructing patients to snort powdered pepper or insert it rectally in an infusion. Not surprisingly, this did not go well. But the theme here is consistent. If it hurts, it must be working, which is how we arrive at mustard plasters. A paste of ground mustard seeds mixed with flour and water, spread onto cloth and laid across the skin. Chest, back, neck, anywhere there was pain. The paste burned, not metaphorically. It created literal chemical burns, blisters, and sometimes permanent scarring. But that burn, they said, was the sign of healing. A way to draw the fever outward, to force circulation, to make the blood remember what it was supposed to do. Children were given mustard plasters for coughs, elderly patients for rheumatism. Everyone else got one eventually. It was a rite of passage, the mark of someone who had suffered enough to be worthy of wellness. And if you thought that was bad, let's talk about fire. Not the accidental kind, the prescribed kind. Moxibustion, an ancient Chinese practice still used today in traditional medicine, involves burning dried mugwort, a plant, near or directly on the skin. Sometimes the moxa is held just above the flesh to warm the area. Other times, it's placed in a small cone and burned directly on a pressure point, leaving a circular burn as a proof of its passage. The goal was to stimulate the flow of qi, energy, vitality, and for some patients it did bring relief. For others, it just brought scars. In India, a similar technique existed using hot irons or cauterizing instruments applied in strategic places to reset the body's balance. Hemorrhoids were burned off. Infected wounds seared shut. Even migraines were treated by cauterizing the scalp. And in Europe, fire played its role there too. St. Fiacre's chair, a stone bench with a hole in the centre, was believed to cure hemorrhoids if you sat on it long enough in prayer. But if that failed, the cure was simple: a red-hot poker, applied with grim resolve. Faith and fire hand in hand. But if fire was too much, there was always ice. Cold water immersion was used for everything from insomnia to madness. Patients were plunged into freezing rivers, ice baths, or simply left naked in the snow. The shock was said to wake the body, or reset the mind. Many never fully woke again. But perhaps the strangest cold therapy came from the 19th century, the use of refrigeration to calm nervous women. Patients were placed in cooled rooms, covered in damp sheets, or even packed in ice. The belief was that overexcitement, particularly of the female variety, could be quelled by lowering the body temperature. If it numbed you, it worked. And if that didn't work, there was always tobacco smoke, not smoked the usual way, blown into the rectum. Known politely as a tobacco enema, this treatment was bizarrely popular in 18th century England and North America. Doctors believed that tobacco stimulated the body and could revive drowning victims or treat constipation, among other things. Special bellows were designed to puff smoke directly into the patient's rear end. They were used on riverbanks, in hospitals, and at home. Eventually, people realised this wasn't particularly effective, and, perhaps more urgently, incredibly unsanitary. But the phrase blowing smoke has never meant quite the same since. And yet, despite all this, people survived. Not all, not most, but enough. Enough to pass on their stories. Enough to write journals, publish treatises, build schools, and leave behind scraps of wisdom buried beneath the muck. Because not every remedy was failure. Not every treatment was madness. Some of them worked, they just hadn't figured out why, yet. And so the leeches kept crawling, the sores kept cutting, the powders kept pouring, because that's what humans do when faced with the unknown. We try. We reach into the dirt and the dark and the strange. We mix frog slime with holy water. We whisper prayers over urine and call it healing. We stitch the world back together with vinegar and horn dust and the bitter hope that something, anything, might help. Because illness is terrifying. And desperation, well, it's creative. Sometimes that desperation looked like ritual. Sometimes it looked like violence. And sometimes it looked like hope in powdered form. Tiny packets of crushed beetles, dried lizards, or ground coral, folded neatly into linen and handed off with the reassurance that someone, somewhere, swore by it. Apothecaries, herbalists, back alley witches, each with their own idea of what would heal the body. And if the cure didn't work, the next one might. There was always another. Snail syrup, for instance, a staple in 17th century European medicine, especially for lung ailments. Slugs and snails would be collected by the dozens, mashed into pulp, and strained through muslin cloth with sugar and wine. The resulting grey liquid was said to soothe the throat and ease consumption, what we now call tuberculosis. There were even illustrated recipes, with careful step-by-step drawings of the snail pressing process. And testimonials too. Aristocratic women claiming miraculous recovery after a week of sipping warm gastropod juice at dawn. If nothing else, it took your mind off the coughing. But there were darker concoctions still, ones not whispered about in polite company. In Renaissance Italy, a number of elite physicians quietly recommended mummy tincture, not the powdered kind bought from forgers, but a more recent variant. A red solution derived from the blood or flesh of the recently executed, mixed with wine or alcohol, sometimes heated, always drunk. It was believed that the vitality of the condemned, cut short in life, still brimming with energy, could be harnessed and transferred. Especially if the execution had been public, especially if the death had been sudden. For epileptics, it was common to press a warm hand against the corpse as soon as the head rolled, or to drink from the still steaming heart. Not in barbarity, but in hope. Desperate hope, dressed in velvet and Latin incantations. And in case you're wondering, yes, people paid for this. A thriving trade in medical cadavers bloomed behind courtrooms and gallows. It was business, sanctified by science, or at least something close to it. Even Queen Elizabeth I is rumoured to have used corpse-derived preparations. Her doctors, steeped in alchemical traditions, believed that life could be extended or restored by any means necessary, and when means ran out, they invented new ones. Take, for example, the use of pigeon blood for eye infections. Popular in early modern Europe, the belief was that the blood of a freshly killed pigeon, still warm, still wet, could draw out infection from the eye. The pigeon would be killed on sight, sometimes sliced in half, and its body pressed directly to the face of the patient. No one's quite sure how or why this started. Perhaps the soft warmth brought comfort. Perhaps a cure happened once, and the story stuck. But the image remains. A noble woman lying still. Her eyes closed beneath the limp body of a dove. Her servants watching silently, waiting for the swelling to go down. And if pigeons weren't available, there were always eels. Yes, eels. In some regions, eels were sliced open and laid across inflamed joints to draw out heat. In others, live eels were fed to the sick in the belief that their slippery vitality would pass through the gut and chase out whatever lingered there. And if none of that helped, perhaps your problem was spiritual. Because for much of history, illness wasn't just physical, it was moral. A punishment, a test, a visitation. And for that, No doctor's bag was complete without relics, prayers, and a well-thumbed Bible. Exorcisms were common treatments for epilepsy, depression, hallucinations, or chronic fatigue. A priest would be called, incense burned, Latin spoken in urgent tones. If the afflicted screamed or convulsed, it was taken as proof that the treatment was working. Many patients were strapped down for this. Others were simply surrounded by chanting villagers. Salt circles, holy water, the repeated use of the word unclean. And for women particularly, this kind of healing could turn brutal. Midwives who helped deliver breech births or provided herbal remedies were often accused of witchcraft if something went wrong. Their knowledge, deep, practical, passed down through generations, was both revered and feared. And when the church decided that too many women were dying in childbirth, or that too many midwives whispered strange words while boiling herbs, they cracked down. Witch trials were not just moral crusades, they were public health campaigns in their own warped way. They removed the competition, silenced women who knew how to treat fevers with willow bark, who could reduce swelling with poultices made of marigold and clay, who understood far too well the boundaries between the living and the dead. And when those women were gone, the doctors stepped in, with metal tools, with foreign herbs, with good intentions and terrible consequences. Consider the caesarean section. It existed in ancient times, but for most of history it was a death sentence. For the mother, almost always. Performed only when the mother had already died or was dying, in a desperate attempt to save the child. There was no anesthesia, no antiseptic, just a knife, a prayer, and the hope that speed might outpace infection. Eventually techniques improved, but slowly, very slowly, and not without sacrifice. And through all of this, the trials, the sores, the syrups, there were still patients. People with fevers and tumours and twisted limbs, with worries, with families, with longings they couldn't quite name. They lined up outside town apothecaries. They waited in smoke-filled rooms. They held their breath while the poultice was applied, or the bone reset, or the blood drained. They closed their eyes and hoped that whatever came next wouldn't hurt as much as the thing that came before. And sometimes it worked. Sometimes it really did. A fever broke. A wound healed. A limb knitted itself back together with time and luck and crude splints. And sometimes the placebo was all they needed. Belief, after all, is powerful. The belief that something is being done, that someone cares enough to do it, that a cure exists, even if it's soaked in goat's milk or lit on fire. The body responds to that belief. It relaxes, it tries, and even when the cure is absurd, even when the method is medieval, the patient might still feel better, at least for a while. And what is medicine, if not the long, slow story of trial and error, of roots and rituals, of bleeding and burning and waiting, always waiting, for something better, for something kinder, for a future that thankfully eventually arrived. But the road to that future was long, and full of frogs, leeches, powders, pastes, screams and smoke. And not all of it is gone. Some of it lingers, in modern treatments with ancient roots, in superstitions dressed in lab coats, in the strange comfort of home remedies passed down from great-grandmothers who once rubbed honey on burns and whispered over warts. Because for all our knowledge, we are still creatures of habit, creatures of myth, creatures who crave stories as much as science. And the best medical treatments, even now, are often both. We want to be healed, we want to be believed. And if that belief comes wrapped in linen, soaked in vinegar, and tied to the wrist with red thread, So be it. The mind may scoff, but the heart remembers. And sometimes that's enough. It's morning now, or something like it. The light is dull and watery through the shutters. You've been sitting on the cot for hours. You don't remember falling asleep, but the wool blanket smells faintly of thyme and something metallic. On the small wooden table beside you sits a bowl of something thick and green, slowly congealing. That would be the moss poultice. Used for centuries across Europe, peat moss and sphagnum moss were praised for their absorbent qualities. Battlefield surgeons packed it into wounds, believing it could draw out pus and infection. And, to be fair, it often helped. Not because of magic, because moss, it turns out, contains mild antibacterial properties. But in medieval medicine, there was no distinction between coincidence and causation. If a wounded man survived moss stuffing, moss became gospel. If another died, the gods had spoken. And so the poultices kept coming. Not just moss. Bread soaked in wine. Cobwebs dusted with flour. Ashes mixed with honey. All pressed gently, sometimes not so gently, into open wounds. In Scotland, it was common to use sheep's wool for dressing injuries. Not clean wool, not boiled or bleached. Raw wool, straight from the fleece, often with the natural lanolin still clinging to it. It was soft, it was warm, it sometimes carried lice. But again, some people lived. And when they did, the method was praised, not the resilience of the patient, not the twist of luck, the method. This was how medical authority worked, a mixture of anecdote, tradition, and whatever didn't kill the last person. And sometimes the reasoning was symbolic. Consider the use of sympathetic powders. A remedy not applied to the patient, but to the weapon that wounded them. Let's say you'd been stabbed. Instead of binding your leg or stitching the wound, the healer might anoint the knife, clean it, rub it with balm, whisper over it. The idea was that the weapon and the wound were spiritually linked, that by treating the tool, you treated the person. It sounds absurd, but in 17th century England, this was not fringe theory. Even respected figures like Sir Kenelm Digby, a philosopher and courtier, swore by it. He famously claimed to have healed a man's gangrenous wound by rubbing a salve onto the bloody bandage that had once covered it, while the man himself lay miles away. The wound, Digby said, closed up instantly. Healers across Europe nodded approvingly. It wasn't just magic, it was medicine. And yet, not all cures were this clean. In some villages, to treat jaundice, a live kitten was sliced open and its warm entrails laid across the patient's stomach. In others, to cure whooping cough, mothers were told to pass their child beneath a donkey's belly at sunrise. No one really knew why, but someone's cousin once got better that way, and that was enough. In parts of Eastern Europe, one treatment for epilepsy involved swallowing a black spider, still alive, encased in dough. The spider was considered an agent of absorption, capable of trapping evil spirits. Swallowing it whole like a bitter pill was believed to draw the illness from within and imprison it in the spider's body, which, if all went well, would then pass harmlessly through the digestive tract. If it didn't, well, spiders are hardy, and if your condition was more visible, say boils or acne, you might be advised to wash your face in the morning dew collected from gravestones. The idea was that the stone held ancestral energy, that death had cooled it, made it holy. And so at dawn, people would tiptoe barefoot through old cemeteries, collecting droplets on linen cloths, dabbing them gently on their cheeks in the hope that the dead would lend their peace to the living. It wasn't uncommon. It wasn't even frowned upon. It was just another remedy, and if that failed, there was the fat of the executed. Yes, again, called human grease in some records, it was sold discreetly in ointments and salves for arthritis, paralysis, and bruising. Executioners themselves were often the suppliers. In many places, they were allowed to keep parts of the body for medicinal sale. The rendered fat would be mixed with herbs and stored in ceramic jars, ready for application to stiff joints or aching backs. It was considered especially potent if the person had died suddenly. Young energy, unspoiled by disease. Not unlike the logic behind gladiator blood in ancient Rome. Romans believed that the blood of fallen gladiators, drunk fresh from the sand, could cure epilepsy and grant strength. Spectators at the Colosseum would rush down after the final blow, scraping at the dirt, scooping what they could into clay cups. It was brutal and deeply normalized. Because medicine, in the absence of understanding, becomes a religion of its own. One with rituals, relics, sacrifices, and believers. Even today, the remnants of those beliefs linger in odd corners of modern culture. The way some people swear by raw garlic for infection, or apple cider vinegar for weight loss, or placing onions in the corners of a room during flu season. Some of it is harmless, some of it might even help, and some of it, well, let's just say we've come a long way, but we carry those echoes, because humans have always preferred doing something over doing nothing. Even if that something involves frog blood, smoke, or snakeskin. Speaking of snakes, snake oil wasn't always a joke. In traditional Chinese medicine, oil from the Chinese water snake was actually used to treat joint pain, and it contained high levels of omega-3 acids. It worked, to a degree. But when Western entrepreneurs caught wind of it in the 19th century, they began selling their own versions, made with mineral oil, turpentine, and sometimes nothing at all. Snake oil became a scam, a symbol of quackery, but its origin wasn't entirely nonsense, just misinterpreted, misused, marketed until it lost all meaning. And that's the story of many of these treatments. They began with observation. A shepherd noticed that lambs lick certain leaves when sick. A mother saw her child's fever ease after sleeping near lavender. A soldier healed faster with honey packed into the wound. And from those flickers of insight, a fire was built. Sometimes it burned away ignorance. Other times it just burned. Because even when a treatment failed, horribly, it still left a story. And stories, when repeated enough, become truth. Or something close to it. And once something becomes truth, well, it takes a long time to unlearn. Especially if it doesn't kill you right away. Especially if someone, somewhere, swears it helped. The line between healing and harming wasn't always easy to see, and sometimes it wasn't there at all. Imagine this, you've got a cough that won't go away. A sharp, rattling kind of cough that feels like it might split your ribs from the inside. You've tried herbs, you've prayed, you've been bled twice, but nothing helps, so someone suggests the burning feather. They hold a goose feather over a flame, catch the smoke in a funnel, and direct it up your nose. The idea is that the pungent fumes will drive out the sickness. Scare it, smoke it, chase it into retreat, it burns. It makes your eyes stream. Your nose runs, your throat closes, and for a few long minutes, you forget you were coughing at all. Later, the cough returns, but only after a strange, hollow silence that someone in the room decides to interpret as progress. It was always like this: trial, pain, a pause, and then either death or a declaration that the medicine must be working. And if the feather failed, there was always red lead, powdered into pills, mixed with milk, and swallowed in small doses. Red lead, also known as minium, was used for centuries as a treatment for ulcers, vomiting, and even menstrual irregularity. No one knew it was poisonous. Or rather, they knew, but they believed that a little poison might purge a worse one. It was all about balance, the lesser evil, the enemy of your enemy. They said the same thing about antimony. A brittle, silvery metal, antimony was ground into fine powder and consumed in what were called perpetual pills. The idea was simple. You swallow the pill, it clears your bowels completely, and then you retrieve it once it exits the body, wash it, and use it again. Some families passed the same pill down for generations. It was efficient, economical, and, of course, deeply toxic. But it worked in a way, because few things emptied the body faster than a heavy metal purge. In a time before germ theory, before microscopes, before the tiniest thing in the world could be known to carry death, people fought illness the only way they knew how, by making the body suffer until something changed. And in that war, everything was a weapon. Burning sage and sulphur in the corners of plague houses, tying toads to the soles of the feet to draw out fever, drinking powdered pearls to calm the heart. In Ming Dynasty China, pearls were thought to cool the blood and soothe the soul. They were crushed into powder and dissolved in teas, sometimes added to ointments for the skin. Only the wealthy could afford it. Everyone else made do with eggshells. And then there were corpse candles. In some European villages, candles made from human fat were used in healing rituals. Not openly, not proudly, but quietly. A whispered tradition. The idea was that the candle's flame, fed by the essence of death, could light the way out of it. The flame was never allowed to go out during the healing. If it flickered, it meant the patient would die. If it burned steady, hope remained. That's what healing looked like for most of history. A flicker in the dark. A guess. A hope. A borrowed ritual from someone else's gods. And sometimes, what looked like healing was just control. In 19th century Europe and America, the rest cure was widely prescribed to women suffering from what doctors called nervous disorders. Depression, anxiety, postpartum exhaustion, even creativity. The cure involved complete isolation. No books, no conversation, no exercise. Just lying in bed for weeks, sometimes months. Alone, in silence. The patient was often force-fed, bathed by others, spoken to only by the doctor. It was supposed to quiet the mind. It broke many instead. Charlotte Perkins Gilman, a writer and activist, underwent this treatment in 1887, and later wrote The Yellow Wallpaper, a chilling short story about a woman slowly unravelling in forced isolation. It was based on her own experience. The doctor who prescribed her the rest cure? He read the story and changed nothing. Because once an idea hardens into doctrine, it doesn't bend easily. Especially not when it's backed by the weight of medicine. And medicine, for most of history, was not just about healing. It was about power. The power to say what illness was, who had it, what it meant. In the Victorian era, masturbation was considered a cause of everything from blindness to hysteria. Children were fitted with spiked chastity belts. Adolescents were subjected to surgical interventions, circumcision without anesthesia, clitoridectomy, or even cauterization of the genitals. This wasn't punishment, they insisted. It was medicine. The body had to be tamed. And if it screamed in the process, well, Healing was never supposed to be painless. This belief stretched far beyond England. In parts of colonial Africa and India, Western doctors introduced modern medical practices to local populations, often without consent. Vaccinations administered en masse, teeth pulled from the unwilling, experiments conducted in the name of science with no explanation, no translation, no pause. It wasn't just ignorance, it was empire. Medicine as a tool of order, of hierarchy, of cultural conquest. And yet, even in those same places, beneath the shadow of the clinic, local healers continued their work. Women who brewed bark into teas, men who pressed plantain leaves into cuts, grandmothers who whispered to the fever and fanned the air until the sweat broke. And the people listened, because they remembered. The ones that came with a bowl of broth and a prayer, a soft cloth on the forehead, a story about how this root once saved a neighbour's son. A cure maybe, maybe not, but kindness at least. And sometimes kindness was enough. The fires burned low now. The smoke curls soft and slow through the rafters, like a thought that forgot where it was going. Somewhere in the dark, someone coughs. A sharp, chest-rattling cough. The kind that never leaves quickly. The kind that makes a room go quiet just to hear how bad it is. And so they reach, as always, for the jar. It's amber-coloured glass, thick, sticky at the rim. Inside is a mixture that once held great promise, pitch and pine tar, boiled with honey and a dash of crushed garlic. A medieval chest remedy. Thick enough to coat the throat. Vile enough to feel like it's working. You take a spoonful. It clings to the teeth. The garlic burns on the way down, but not in a dangerous way. More like a scolding. A reminder that you're alive. And that someone, somewhere, once believed this could pull the sickness from your lungs like smoke from a chimney. It's not even the strangest remedy on the shelf. Next to it sits a jar of powdered bone, crushed antlers, to be precise, elk or deer, depending on who you asked. In some parts of Eastern Europe and Siberia, it was believed that the antlers held a kind of life force. Ground finely enough and steeped in boiling water, the powder made a tonic for virility, strength, and long life. Men drank it before battle, women after childbirth. Elders sipped it with the kind of reverence reserved for holy things. Because a part of healing was always belief. Not in the chemical reaction, not in the microbial balance, but in the gesture, the ritual, the act of doing something, anything, to keep the shadow from taking hold. And that act, whatever it looked like, became sacred, even when it involved things better left buried, like the skull of an unbaptized child, used in some early modern European traditions to cure epilepsy. Not the whole skull, just a piece, ground to dust, dissolved in wine. It had to be unbaptized, they said, because the soul was still raw, still capable of absorbing sin and sickness. This wasn't superstition in the margins. It was doctrine, prescribed, administered. And then, when the child still shook with seizures, when the wine did nothing but stain the lips, they would pray harder and blame the mother. She must have wept too much while pregnant, or eaten the wrong root, or walked beneath the moon when she shouldn't have. The sickness had to come from somewhere, and if not from her, then perhaps from the stars. Astrological medicine ruled much of medieval Europe. Physicians didn't just study anatomy, they studied the heavens. A treatment wasn't valid unless the stars approved. Bleeding had to be timed to the moon. Surgery avoided during certain planetary alignments. Medicines mixed only when Mars was in a favourable position. The body was seen as a reflection of the cosmos. each organ ruled by a planet, each sickness a ripple from the heavens. If you had kidney trouble, Venus was to blame. If your liver failed, it was Jupiter. A bad cough during a Mercury transit? Expect confusion and relapse. This wasn't fantasy. This was science. Learned men wrote charts and guides, mapping the zodiac across the human frame with mathematical precision. The stars were not distant. They were in your blood. And if you died, well, perhaps your stars had run out, but not all healing looked upward. Some of it looked inward and downward, toward the very darkest places. In ancient Babylon, physicians used liver divination to diagnose disease. A sheep would be sacrificed, its liver removed and studied, its shape, colour, markings. Special clay models were used for comparison, each labelled with interpretations. A bulge here meant fever. A dark patch there meant betrayal, or possibly plague. This was not dismissed as magic. This was scholarship. Royal scribes recorded the readings. Kings made decisions based on them. And if the signs were bad, the patient might be prescribed a ritual washing, not with water, with beer. Beer was sacred in Mesopotamia. Not just a drink, but a cure. It was used in ceremonies, offerings, and yes, medicine. Mixed with herbs, poured over wounds, consumed in precise dosages for stomach ailments, depression, and the occasional bout of spiritual malaise. Because medicine wasn't just about the body, it was about keeping the soul in the right place, keeping the unseen things quiet, pleased, contained. In medieval Iceland, people feared a spirit called a tilbury, a witch's creature created from dead flesh and animated to steal milk. If milk soured or went missing, it wasn't bacteria. It was the tilbury. And the cure? You didn't just pray, you burned the bones, you salted the doorstep, you boiled herbs and smeared them on the cow's udders or to ward off spirits. Even then, medicine was layered. Some of it worked, some of it terrified, some of it just kept your hands busy while the fever took its course. And if the spirit was in the blood, then you might turn to the sweating sickness cure. England, 15th century. The mysterious sweat swept through towns like a whisper made of knives. No one knew how it spread. It came fast, killed faster, and left the survivors unsure if they'd ever really been alive before. The most trusted treatment? Wrap the patient in layers of wool, seal the windows, stoke the fire until the walls wept condensation, then let them sweat. Pour ale into their mouth if they can drink. Let them lie in their own dampness until the fever breaks or doesn't. Some recovered, many didn't, and still the wool blankets were pulled tighter, the sweat collected on rags and examined for signs. Dark sweat meant death. Clear sweat meant hope. You never wanted to see clear sweat. It meant the body still had something to give. Even if it wasn't much, the floor beneath you is still warm. Not with comfort, exactly, but with the lingering press of bodies that came before. Sick ones, mostly. Wrapped in linens, sweating through night after night, clutching whatever root or relic had been placed in their hands. You can almost see them, these people. The man with the throat too swollen to speak, muttering thanks between spoonfuls of warm onion broth. The woman with her feet in mustard water, face pale, trying to smile as someone rubs a charm against her chest. The child, asleep, or close enough to it, with chamomile tied around her neck, and a pinch of salt tucked beneath the pillow to keep the demons out. Every cure, a ritual. Every ailment, a mystery to decode. And in that mystery, strange alliances were born. Between science and folklore. Between plants and prayers. between the living and the not quite dead. In the early days of plague, one treatment was to apply a paste made from crushed emeralds, thistle, and dried blood to the boils. If that failed, as it usually did, the next step might be to press a live chicken against the swelling, not for warmth, but because chickens were believed to absorb the sickness through their skin. As the story went, the illness would pass from the human to the bird, and the bird, unable to handle it, would sicken, die, and carry the affliction with it into the dirt. Sometimes, the same chicken was used on multiple patients. It did not improve the odds. And when chickens ran out, people reached for other things. Crushed rose petals soaked in vinegar, toad lungs dried on the windowsill, pieces of parchment with holy words written backward, folded and swallowed whole. Because what else could they do? They didn't know about bacteria, or viruses, or how tightly the air could carry grief. They just knew that people were dying, and that something, anything, was better than nothing. So they covered their mouths with cloth soaked in camphor oil, lit fires in alleyways to clean the air, rubbed garlic on their wrists, carried pomanders filled with herbs and resin to block the stink of death. Some believed that holding a sweet-smelling apple under your nose could keep the plague from climbing inside you. The logic wasn't entirely wrong. The smell of rot meant danger. So the smell of sweetness became a kind of shield. Doctors, if you could call them that, wore long beaked masks filled with cloves and lavender. The beak kept the bad air at bay, or so they thought. It made them look like birds. Grim birds. Birds that arrived when death did, then left before the final sigh. The mask became a symbol, but behind it, still just a man, guessing, and often guessing badly. In many plague cities, one of the most common treatments was flagellation, not of the patient, but of the people. Masses of barefoot men in hoods, walking from town to town, whipping their own backs in bloody rhythm. They believed the plague was God's punishment. That pain might buy mercy. That bleeding openly might show heaven they were sorry. It didn't work, but it gave them something to do. Something that felt like control in a world where even the air betrayed them. And it wasn't just plague that summoned these rituals. Epilepsy, gout, melancholia. Everything had its custom, its curse. Its story passed down from someone who knew someone who once got better. For gout, you might be told to wrap your feet in roasted onions and eel skins, then place them inside a sheep's stomach overnight. For melancholy, a glass of wine steeped with powdered coral and crushed daisies. For insomnia, warm milk poured over a Bible page and sipped before dawn. If the page had psalms on it, even better. And if none of that worked, you prayed, or you gave up, or you waited for someone older to tell you what they'd seen done in their youth, when times were worse and medicine more brutal, and somehow they'd survived. Because people did survive. Not all, not even most, but enough to remember. Enough to teach. Enough to hand down these strange cures. Not because they believed in them entirely, but because they couldn't forget. Because sometimes, even the worst remedies came wrapped in a kind of tenderness. The cloth soaked in elderflower tea held to the forehead of a screaming child. The stale bread warmed over coals and pressed to a bruised knee. The slow stirring of herbal syrup in a kitchen while the world outside burned. People did what they could. They always have, even when the cure was a blade. In ancient India, the practice of Koshara Sutra was developed to treat anal fistulas, a painful and often life-threatening condition. The technique involved coating a thread with herbal paste, then threading it through the fistula to slowly cut and heal over time. It took weeks, sometimes months, but it worked better than anything Europe had. Yet in European medicine, the same condition was treated with cauterization, red hot irons, or if the patient was rich enough, a surgical knife followed by weeks of bleeding and leeching. Louis XIV, the Sun King himself, suffered from anal fistulas. His treatment was so public and so painful that it became a spectacle. And when he survived, fistula surgeries became fashionable, even for people who didn't need them, because if the king endured it, surely it must be wise. Pain, once again, as a kind of status. To suffer was to be healed was to be pure. And so people lined up for bloodletting, for blistering, for treatments that scarred them, frightened them, and often did nothing but leave them weaker than before. And still they believed. Because sometimes the belief itself was the only part that worked, and sometimes that was enough. The night stretches long, and the oil in the lamp burns lower with every breath. Someone has left the shutters cracked, just enough for the breeze to find its way in, just enough to stir the dried herbs hanging from the rafters. Lavender, chamomile, a bit of yarrow tied with old twine and hope. You can't smell it anymore. Not really. But you remember what it was supposed to mean. Calm, cleanliness, protection. Not from demons exactly. Not always. But from the things that crept in quietly. The ones that started with a tickle in the throat, or a shadow under the eye, or a sleepless night that turned into a week. And once the sickness took hold, the world around you changed shape. The home became a ward, the kitchen an apothecary, the fireplace an altar. Everything bent itself toward one purpose, getting you back, pulling you out, and if not, easing the way. Which is where we arrive at one of history's oldest and gentlest remedies, honey. Before pills, before powders, before prescriptions with side effects longer than the label itself, there was honey. It was used on wounds, poured into ears, swirled into teas, rubbed on the gums of teething babies. It soothed coughs, softened skin, preserved meat, dressed burns, and in some cultures it even preserved the dead. The ancient Egyptians used honey not only as medicine, but as embalming fluid, a way to coat the body in sweetness before sending it into the next world. In Greece, Hippocrates wrote of honey as both cure and cleanser, and in Ayurveda, the Indian system of medicine, honey, madhu, was considered a base for hundreds of herbal formulations. Sweetness as medicine, a kindness the body could taste. But not all that was sweet came without risk. In parts of the Black Sea region, wild rhododendron honey, known as mad honey, was collected in small quantities and used with caution. The bees that made it fed on toxic flowers. The honey they produced caused dizziness, hallucinations, and a drop in blood pressure. Too much could be fatal. But in small doses, it was used as a sedative, a treatment for high blood pressure, a ritual offering. People took it on purpose, because sometimes the edge of danger looked like medicine too, and that edge wasn't always bitter. Sometimes it was hidden in a bowl of soup. In the Middle Ages, one recipe for fertility involved stewing the womb of a hare with parsley and saffron, then eating it in silence on the night of a full moon. No one knew why it worked, if it worked, but the instructions were passed down carefully, in hushed tones, woman to woman, as if the wisdom itself might evaporate if said too loudly. And fertility treatments, across cultures, were often the strangest of all. From powdered pearls to rooster testicles, from the ashes of burned wedding sheets to nightly recitations of charms carved into lead, Couples trying to conceive were willing to try anything. Even the child stone, a round, smooth pebble, believed to aid conception if kept in the bed or soaked in water and drunk before intercourse. The stone was passed from family to family with great ceremony. If a child was born 9 months later, the stone was said to be full. If not, it was tired and needed to be rested beside a holy relic. People needed to believe there was a system, that even the most mysterious and sacred act, making life, could be helped along by the right chant, the right herb, the right hand. And in some ways, they weren't wrong, because belief itself is powerful, enough to lower blood pressure, enough to reduce pain, enough to make a cup of warm water and mint feel like salvation. That's what the placebo effect is, really. The body obeying a story it wants to be true. And if that story involves whispering over a sprig of rosemary or burying a clump of hair at a crossroads, so be it. Modern medicine still struggles to replicate that power, because it can't be bottled, but it can be found. In the past, in the old cures that were half science, half lullaby. Like the practice of swaddling the sick, not infants, adults. In some ancient Slavic traditions, a person suffering from grief or fever would be wrapped tightly in blankets, sometimes with herbs stitched into the seams. The bundle would be warmed by the fire, sometimes gently rocked, and left alone for a night or two. The idea was to return the body to its first safety, to trick the nerves into remembering comfort, to hold the pain still long enough for healing to begin. It wasn't just physical illness they treated this way, it was heartbreak, shock, souls that had been frightened loose. And the healer didn't give advice. They gave warmth, pressure, stillness. Sometimes that was all it took. Sometimes it wasn't enough, but it always meant something. And meaning, even without explanation, is often where healing begins. You see it again in the use of sleep cures. In Victorian asylums, patients deemed hysterical or manic were sometimes sedated into days of sleep. Not rest, not naps. True, prolonged unconsciousness. Opium, chloral hydrate, ether. The goal was to reset the brain, like a broken clock being wound back to the beginning. Sometimes it helped. Other times, the patients never fully woke. The method was crude, dangerous, but it had a certain logic. Let the brain sleep through its worst hour. Let the mind forget how afraid it is. Let the body hold on to life until the soul decides to stay. Even now, we say things like, sleep it off. We tuck blankets tight around feverish bodies. We dim the lights, draw the curtains, and speak more softly, as if illness can hear us. As if it might leave if we don't scare it. And somewhere in the back of the mind, we remember that the line between sleep and healing has always been blurred. That maybe the oldest cure in the world is simply rest, quiet. A place to lie down and not be asked for anything. A breath in, a breath out, and the hope that, in the morning, the world will be less sharp, or that we will be stronger, or that the tea will be hot enough to carry us through one more day. There's a sound the body makes when it finally rests. Not quite silence, but a kind of absence. No coughing, no shifting, no questions. Just the weight of breath, long and low and even. That sound filled old homes like prayer. It meant the medicine was working, or that the sickness had stopped trying. Either way, it was welcome. And in those moments, healers took their victories where they could. Not in miracles, not in sudden recoveries, but in the small things. The bowl emptied, the fever broken, the patient no longer moaning into the crook of their arm. They'd seen enough to know that healing was rarely dramatic. It was quiet, uneven, a thing you noticed only once it had already begun. And yet many tried to force it, to summon it with smoke and bells and bitter roots. In 18th century Germany, one treatment for insomnia involved placing warm baked apples on either side of the head, close to the ears. The theory was that the steam, mixed with the scent of fruit and sugar, would lull the mind back to calm. Some versions included crushed poppy seeds in the apple's core. Others added nutmeg and wine. The patient would lie there, eyes closed, arms folded over the stomach, like a corpse prepared for burial, waiting for sleep to rise from the warmth. Some said it worked. Some said it just made them hungry. But the logic was consistent. Comfort the senses, and the body will follow. That same principle guided the use of lavender satchels, silk-wrapped rosemary bundles, and oil of clove dabbed behind the ears. Not just to heal, but to persuade the body to relax, to lean back into the world. And the world, if it had anything to offer in return, often came in the form of plants. The old healers knew this. They memorized their seasons, their soil, their temperaments, knew which flowers liked to bloom after the frost, and which roots turned bitter too quickly. They picked valerian for nerves, yarrow for wounds, comfrey for broken bones, willow bark for pain. Willow bark, nature's aspirin, chewed or brewed into tea long before it had a brand name. It worked because it contained salicin, a compound the body converts into salicylic acid. No one knew that then, they just knew it helped. And that was enough to pass it down. But plants weren't always used gently. In certain old traditions, fevers were treated with nettle floggings. Yes, floggings. The patient would be struck lightly, or sometimes not so lightly, with fresh, stinging nettles. The goal was to raise welts, to stimulate circulation, to draw the heat outward. The pain was intense, the logic cruelly simple. If the skin could scream louder than the fever, maybe the body would forget it was dying. And in some places that reasoning extended even further. People were buried up to their necks in hot sand to sweat out illness, left in smoke huts with burning herbs, rolled in snow to shock the sickness from their bones. In Siberia, certain reindeer herding peoples used steam tents built over pits of heated stones. Patients would lie inside, drinking herbal brews, breathing deeply while the air shimmered with heat and resin. When they emerged, sweating, pale, silent, they were wrapped in skins and made to sleep for hours, sometimes days. It was healing as endurance, and endurance was often all a body had, because when nothing else worked, there was always fire. Controlled, directed, revered. Cautery wasn't just for wounds. It was used to treat back pain, headaches, even eye strain. Heated metal rods were applied to pressure points on the back or temples. The smell of burning flesh was not incidental. It was proof. The body marked with suffering, so the soul would know someone had tried. Sometimes the rods were shaped like stars or moons, branded into the skin in sacred symbols. Healing made visible. A scar that said, "I was broken, but they didn't stop trying." In the Islamic world, particularly during the medieval Golden Age, cautery, called al-kay, was a respected treatment, described in detailed medical texts, taught in academies, applied with precision. It wasn't superstition, it was protocol, but not all fires were meant to touch the skin. In Eastern Europe, sick rooms were sometimes cleansed with firewalking. A ritual healer would walk barefoot over hot coals, carrying herbs or water, chanting prayers. The idea was to draw the sickness out, not from the patient directly, but from the house. cleanse the space, to frighten the illness away. It wasn't meant to cure the body. It was meant to make the room safe again. Because sickness, once it took root, didn't just affect the person. It infected the air, the furniture, the dreams. So people scattered salt in corners, hung mirrors with cloth, placed a knife under the bed, point out, not to stab, just to warn. Because illness in those days wasn't always seen as an invader. It was something that arrived, that stayed, that sometimes listened. And in case it did, you had to speak carefully, to keep your voice low, to ask it, quietly, respectfully, to leave. And if it wouldn't, then came the bitter herbs, the bile-coloured teas, the long nights of chanting, and the healer with the knife. Because when prayer failed, and warmth wasn't enough, and the gods seemed distant, someone had to take action, even if it meant blood. There's a kind of quiet that only comes after long fever breaks. Not relief exactly, not celebration, just stillness. The kind that settles over a room like dust. No one moves too quickly, no one speaks too loud, the patient breathes evenly, the water in the bowl has gone cool, and the healer just sits, hands folded, watching for what comes next. Because healing, in the old ways, wasn't something you could declare. It wasn't a line you crossed, a curtain you pulled back. It was a slope, a long one, sometimes gentle, sometimes not, but always uncertain, and filled with shadows. Which is why the old cure books are so full of contradiction. One treatment begins with, "Do not disturb the spirit," and the next recommends screaming the name of a saint into the afflicted person's ear until they convulse. For centuries, epilepsy was thought to be divine in origin, a punishment or a sign. In Greece, they called it the sacred disease. In Rome, it was seen as a curse from the gods. In medieval Europe, it became the falling sickness, and its victims were often feared, revered, or both. One common treatment? Tying the finger of a dead man around the patient's neck. Another? Drinking the blood of a gladiator killed in combat. Still another, gentler method. Placing a piece of bread on the head of the patient during a seizure, then feeding it to a dog. If the dog survived, the illness would pass. If it didn't, well, the dog's sacrifice would not be forgotten. These remedies weren't designed for comfort. They were designed for control, for assurance, for the feeling that something was being done while the body betrayed itself. And sometimes that betrayal was blamed on the eyes. The evil eye is one of the most enduring medical spiritual concepts in human history. From ancient Mesopotamia to modern Mediterranean villages, the idea persisted that a person, often unknowingly, could curse another simply by looking at them with envy or malice or too much attention. The symptoms were vague: headache, nausea, sudden fatigue, unexplainable bad luck. The cure, many. In Turkey, a blue and white glass amulet. In Italy, a red horn charm. In Greece, an olive branch burned while prayers were whispered in threes. In some Jewish traditions, spitting, or the sound of spitting, was thought to deflect the eye. Not real spit, just the gesture, the noise, a token of defiance. Because sometimes illness wasn't about bacteria, it was about boundaries. Something had been crossed. A look held too long. A word spoken at the wrong time. And to make it right again, you had to undo the knot that tied you to the harm. Which brings us to knots themselves. In early Anglo-Saxon medicine, one treatment for fevers involved tying 9 knots in a thread and wearing it around the neck. Each knot was made while speaking a charm aloud, a kind of verbal code meant to trap the illness. If the fever persisted, the thread was untied one knot at a time, under moonlight, while burning sage. The charm ended with the words, "Go now, fever. Go to the hill. Go to the tree. Go to the stream." A gentle exile, a reminder that the body was not a prison, but a house, and sickness could be shown the door. You find this again in folk practices across the British Isles, where warts were treated not with salves or blades, but with stories. Take a piece of meat, rub it on the wart, then bury the meat at a crossroads at midnight. As the meat decayed, so too would the wart, or tie a horsehair around it. Count to 7. Whisper the name of someone you'd wronged, then let the hair vanish in running water. It wasn't about science. It was about restitution, balance, the idea that the body mirrored the soul, and that something physical could be healed by addressing what had been broken in silence. And it wasn't always about curing. Sometimes it was about enduring. In 17th century France, a common treatment for melancholy was to live among the dead. Not literally, but close. Patients were instructed to visit cemeteries daily, to sit in the shade of mausoleums, to walk between graves barefoot, to remember the silence, to let go of fear by getting used to the end. It wasn't entirely unwise. There's something in that stillness, in the reminders that the world continues even as the body falters. But the methods could turn cruel, especially for those on the margins. Women, particularly, bore the weight of medicine's failures. The fainting couch, the ice bath, the isolation cell, the wandering womb. Hysteria was a diagnosis stretched to fit nearly any discomfort. Grief, anger, sexual desire, boredom, rebellion. And the treatments were as varied as they were absurd. Some were gentle, fragrant oils, massages, enforced rest. Others were surgical. Clitoridectomies, ovary removals, partial lobotomies, administered to keep the body from wanting what the world had no intention of giving. They were called cures. They were not. And yet, within the ruins of these brutal methods, something persisted. A kind of grace, not in the treatments, but in the people who endured them, who passed stories to one another in whispers, who wrote letters, kept journals, shared the names of midwives and herbalists who knew better. Because behind every strange treatment was a stranger truth. Someone was trying to understand, to soothe, to give the body something, anything, that might feel like help. And in that trying, a thread was formed, from hand to hand, from hearth to hearth, a history of healing that's equal parts horror and hope, because even the worst cures came from a place of belief, and belief sometimes is all that stands between a body and its unravelling. There's a strange dignity in the way old medical tools sit now behind glass. Polished forceps, bone saws, enema syringes as long as a forearm, each one labelled carefully with a brass plaque and a soft spotlight, museum quiet. No blood, no screams, no smell. Just the illusion of understanding. But the truth is, most of these tools didn't heal. Not reliably, not even often. They were guesses, sharpened into steel. Implements of hope more than precision, carried by men in coats and aprons who tried to look sure of themselves, even when they weren't. And nowhere was this more obvious than in the treatment of madness. Before psychiatry, before serotonin reuptake inhibitors and cognitive behavioural therapy, mental illness was a creature to be trapped, caged, shouted at, burned out. One method? Trepanation again. A hole in the skull to release the spirits. If that didn't work, cold baths. Ice water immersions that left the skin blue and the lungs gasping. If that didn't work, spinning chairs. A patient strapped into a contraption that whirled like a top, designed to jostle the brain back into place. If that didn't work, a dose of purgatives. Something to empty the stomach, the bowels, the soul. And if all of that failed, isolation. Not just physical, sensory, rooms without light, without sound, without company. It was called a cure, even when it was nothing more than a long forgetting. And yet, not all who treated the mind took this path. Some healers turned to music, to rhythm, to chanting. In parts of West Africa, drumming was, and still is, used to recalibrate the body. Not just the mind, but the spirit, the heartbeat, the breath. A steady pulsing rhythm to remind the patient that they are part of something. Something that moves, that dances, that lives. And sometimes that worked better than any knife. In the Middle East, there were practices that used scent to stir the mind from its fog. Frankincense, myrrh, spikenard. Oils dabbed on the temples, burned on coals beside the bed. Not just as perfume, but as medicine. And in parts of India, mantras, repeated syllables spoken softly again and again, were used to soothe the mind, to tame the thoughts that clawed too hard against the inside of the skull. You didn't have to believe in the gods for it to work. You just had to believe in rhythm, in repetition, in the possibility that calm could be rebuilt, one breath at a time. And belief was medicine, not just in ritual, but in diagnosis, because a healer's words had weight. To be told you would live was not a guarantee, but it was a blessing, a permission. And to be told you would die, well, that could become its own illness. That's why so many healing traditions guarded their language. A healer might never say the word death aloud. They might speak in riddles. Call the illness a visitor, a test, a journey, anything but what it really was. Because to name it too early might give it shape, give it teeth. And sometimes patients were never told at all. They were treated, federal, sung to, held, let to slip away without the burden of knowing. Was that kindness? Was it cruelty? It depends on the room, on the culture, on the century, and on whether the person in the bed was considered worthy of saving. Because not everyone was. Their bodies were often used for study more than care, dissected, experimented on, displayed. In 19th century Europe and America, hospitals for the indigent often doubled as medical schools. Students practiced procedures on those who had no say. Amputations, ligation, eye surgeries, vaginal fistula repairs. All done without anaesthesia, without consent, and often without apology. These were not healers. They were mechanics, tinkering on lives deemed disposable. And still, sometimes the patient survived. Not because of the treatment, but in spite of it. And when they did, the cure was praised, never the endurance. But there were places where care was different, where healing meant something else. In indigenous communities across the Americas, illness was often seen as a disharmony between person and place, between body and community, between the living and the ancestors. The treatment? Ceremony. Drumming. Smoke. Words passed from elder to healer to patient. Plants that grew only in the right soil. Water drawn before sunrise. A feather placed beneath the tongue during sleep. These weren't rituals to be deciphered. They were acts of recognition. A way of saying, we see you, you are not alone. And in a way, that is the oldest medicine of all, to be witnessed. to be touched with care, to be given the dignity of a body treated gently, even when the outcome is uncertain, even when the fever climbs, even when the blood darkens, even when the healer knows, in the private hollow of their chest, that the cure will not come in time. Still they wipe the brow, still they boil the herbs, still they sing, because sometimes healing doesn't mean surviving. It means being held as you go. The room is darker now. Not night yet, but the kind of hour that forgets what it's supposed to be. The kind where the sun hides behind clouds and the walls feel too close. Someone stirs under a blanket. Someone else ladles soup from a pot without speaking. No one looks directly at the patient. It's not fear. It's a kind of respect. Because sickness, in many cultures, was sacred. Not welcome, not good, but sacred, set apart, a threshold. And when someone crossed that threshold, they weren't entirely in the world anymore. Not until the fever passed. Not until the breath deepened. Not until their dreams returned to something recognizable. So people spoke more softly, walked more lightly. They closed windows, not just against cold, but against spirits. In some traditions, mirrors were turned toward the wall, names were not spoken. And if the patient began to speak in riddles or languages no one recognized, that wasn't necessarily alarming. It just meant the soul had wandered farther than the rest of the body. In some parts of Eastern Europe, a bowl of water was placed beneath the bed, not for drinking, but to give the soul something to reflect into, should it need to find its way back. In others, coins were placed under the tongue, not as payment for death, but as an anchor for life. Heavy, familiar, real. The healer's role in these cases was not to conquer the illness. It was to accompany the sick through it, like a guide through a dense forest. You didn't run ahead, you didn't drag them. You just walked beside them, and in walking told stories. Because stories were medicine too. In Inuit traditions, storytelling was used not just to entertain, but to realign the spirit. If someone became despondent, withdrawn, or sick without cause, a story would be told, one with tension, danger, and resolution. The idea was to lead the listener's mind out of its tangle, to remind the body of how it felt to survive. And it worked, not always, but often enough that the practice endured. Even now, in hospital wards and hospice rooms, you'll sometimes hear it. The soft retelling of a memory, a joke from a time before illness, a song half remembered, something to tether the patient to the world as the body flinches and forgets. Because forgetting is one of the great cruelties of sickness. It erases appetite, rhythm, identity. The patient is not who they were. They are this new thing. Tired, strange, afraid. So the healer tells them who they are, by cooking their favourite meal, by brushing their hair just so, by placing a warm stone in their hand like they used to when they were a child and scared of the wind. It is a slow reassembling, a kind of sacred carpentry. And when it works, when the patient begins to laugh again, or argue, or ask for a different kind of tea, you know the worst has passed. Or at least has paused, but not all healing is gentle. In early colonial America, some believed that illness was caused by imbalances of the animal spirits within the blood. To fix this, they used what was called counter-irritation. If the body ached in one place, they inflicted pain in another. Burns, blisters, deep cuts along the forearm to let the spirits escape. It was believed that by creating a new wound, the old one would be forced to retreat. The body's attention would shift. The illness would be tricked into leaving. It rarely worked. But in the moment, it felt like action. And action, however painful, was often more comforting than waiting. Which is why people let themselves be leeched, why they drank boiling vinegar, why they allowed doctors to insert sharp metal tubes into places no one speaks of. Because they needed to believe the cure was worse than the disease, that if it hurt enough, it meant something good was happening. This belief was often encouraged by doctors, by family, by survivors. Pain is weakness leaving the body. Fever is the fire that burns away the poison. Suffering makes you stronger. And in some cases that might have been true, but in many it simply made people more quiet, more afraid to say how badly they were hurting, more likely to lie still when something in their gut told them the cure wasn't working. And that silence too was part of the medicine, because sometimes being a patient meant disappearing, letting others decide, nodding at the tincture, swallowing the powder, submitting to the knife, and hoping that obedience would be enough. It wasn't always, but it gave the healer one less variable to worry about, and that mattered, because the healer, for all their power, was also afraid. Afraid of losing, afraid of being wrong, afraid of watching someone slip away while their hands were still full of remedies that had worked yesterday, or the day before, or on someone else entirely. They carried that weight differently in different times. Some cloaked it in confidence, others in ritual, still others in silence. But it was there, in the way they cleaned their tools, in the way they didn't meet your eyes after the fourth day, in the way they stood too still when the fever rose, as if willing the body beneath the blanket to stay anchored by sheer force of watching. Because sometimes that was all they had. The watching, the waiting, the soft murmur of "stay with me" that no one ever called a prescription, but maybe should have. You can feel the walls breathing now. Not literally, of course, but they've taken in so much. Heat, size, the scent of camphor and old milk, that they seem to exhale between footsteps. The floorboards remember things. The way a chair creaked when someone sat vigil. The rattle in a throat just before it quieted. The way someone once said, "thank you," even though the fever had already taken their name. Rooms like this keep stories whether we want them to or not. And those stories often include the healer. Not the kind who wears white. The older kind. The woman with herbs hanging from her belt. The man with hands too steady for a shepherd, but too rough for a scribe. The midwife. The bone setter. The one who didn't own a book, but could feel illness by touching your wrist. They knew things, not always the right things, but enough. Enough to be trusted. Enough to be feared. Because in most villages, the healer lived close to the edge, just far enough outside town to raise eyebrows. Just close enough to be needed when blood ran too fast or too thick. They didn't ask for coin, they asked for eggs, or bread, or a bit of cloth, whatever the family could spare. They worked by moonlight, they smelled of garlic and wormwood, they sometimes sang while they crushed roots. And they knew the names of all the children born in that place, even the ones who hadn't stayed long. But their knowledge made them dangerous. Especially when it didn't line up with the church, or with the university-trained men who arrived with their polished boots and Latin diagnoses. So slowly, methodically, the folk healers were pushed aside, declared heretical, or unscientific, or simply forgotten. Some went quietly, some burned, but their methods lived on, in recipes tucked inside recipe books, in grandmothers who still boiled nettle for spring fevers, in the way someone ties a red thread around a child's wrist without thinking why. Because even after the healer was gone, The body remembered. It remembered how to heal with warmth, how to wait, how to survive the winter on bone broth and stubbornness, and it remembered what to fear. Hospitals, for much of history, were not places of healing. They were places you went to die, or to disappear. For the poor, for the incurable, for the contagious. Charity hospitals offered beds, sometimes soup, always rules. You surrendered your clothes, your hair might be cut, your name might be written down incorrectly. Your body became one of many, rows of them, breathing in sync, coughing out of sync. Visitors were rare, cleanliness was inconsistent, and doctors came only when it was useful to them, when they wanted to teach a student, or test a theory, or try out a new tool that looked promising on paper but hadn't yet met real flesh. You weren't a person there. You were a lesson. And yet, even there, kindness found its way in. A nurse with calloused hands who hummed old lullabies while spooning broth into your mouth. A volunteer who brought fresh flowers in from the market, even though they were forbidden. A fellow patient who told stories to keep the fear out of the room after dark. Because even when medicine forgot to be human, people didn't. And those small mercies mattered. They still do. You see them now in waiting rooms. In how someone offers a tissue before the tears start. In how a stranger will lift your coat from the floor when you're too exhausted to notice it's fallen. Modern medicine is brilliant, precise, capable of things that would seem like magic even 100 years ago. But it still leans on something ancient, on comfort, on attention, on the old knowledge that what hurts must also be seen. Because not all healing happens in the body. Some of it happens in the silence between questions, in the pressure of a palm on your shoulder, in the feeling that someone is there, not fixing you, not rescuing you, just staying. Just holding steady until the worst part passes. And sometimes it does. And sometimes it doesn't. But the hand remains. And that too is medicine. The oldest kind. The hearth has long since cooled. Only ash remains in the corners. Faint grey fingerprints of what once was flame. The light in the room now comes from somewhere softer. Maybe a candle. Maybe the moon through warped glass. Either way, it doesn't try too hard. It lets the shadows be what they are. And in those shadows, a kind of memory lingers. The kind that doesn't speak aloud, but waits for you to notice it. You can almost hear it if you sit still long enough. The wheeze of a chest too tired to lift itself. The drip of a remedy poured one slow drop at a time. The whisper of someone saying, "Just another night. If she can make it to morning, she'll be all right." That was the rhythm of old sickness. Not measured in minutes, measured in nights. Because most treatments didn't work quickly, or precisely, or reliably. They worked by endurance. You endured the poultices, the bitter drinks, the blistering plasters, the smoke in the eyes, the cold water poured over the scalp at dawn, the warm wax smeared on aching joints, the prayer spoken over and over until even the body seemed to hum with it. And if you endured long enough, the fever broke. Or you did. One of the two. That was the gamble. And that gamble didn't spare the powerful kings, queens, emperors. They all bled just like anyone else. And they all turned to the same desperation when the coughing began, or the skin paled, or the mind slipped sideways. Some took mercury. In Tudor England, mercury was used as a treatment for syphilis, rubbed into the skin, inhaled as vapour, swallowed in pill form. The phrase "a night in the mercury bath" was enough to silence most rooms. It was brutal, painful, deadly in its own right, But if you were sick enough, it was worth trying. Even if it made your teeth fall out. Even if it made your skin peel. Even if it drove you mad before it cured you. Because syphilis was madness already. It turned strong men to shadows. Made poets write nonsense and generals weep in the dark. And so they took the cure, over and over. Until they either died of the disease or died trying to outrun it. There was no third option. And for women, the picture was no gentler. A woman suffering from green sickness, what we now call anemia, might be told to marry quickly, to bear children, to drink wine steeped in iron filings, to rub her legs with vinegar and salt. If that failed, she might be bled, because nearly every condition was treated by removing something: blood, bile, sweat, tears. The idea was that the body was a system of humours, 4 sacred fluids that must be balanced: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Too much of one, and you were doomed. Too little, and you were just as lost. Doctors would examine the colour of your urine, the texture of your stool, the smell of your sweat. They would chart your pulse and consult the stars. They would listen, not to your voice, but to your fluids. You were a vessel, and they were trying to keep it from overflowing or emptying completely. And the instruments they used, let's not romanticize them: knives, hooks, razors. The scarificator, a brass device with spring-loaded blades that would cut into the skin in neat little rows for bloodletting. Efficient, clean, and terrifying. The cupping jar, heated and placed on the skin to draw blood to the surface, then sliced open to release it. The bruises lasted for days. The enema syringe, metal, hand-pumped, with attachments for the mouth or the rectum. Used not just for cleansing, but for feeding in cases of extreme illness. Broth and wine administered rectally when the patient refused to eat. No dignity, just necessity. And still, people lived. Not all, not most, but enough. Enough to write about it, to warn others, to make art about it, to pass the story down so that someday someone might understand it better than they did. Because even then, they knew they didn't know everything. Even the greatest physicians of the age admitted it. They wrote it in the margins, in small, careful script. Patient improved, but cause uncertain. Or symptoms receded. Perhaps the moon has changed. There was humility in it, and fear, and sometimes even wonder. Because every once in a while, someone would survive who shouldn't have. The boy with the swollen neck, who couldn't breathe for 3 days, then woke up asking for bread. The old woman whose fever turned her nails blue, but who lived long enough to see the snow melt. The soldier who took a pike to the gut and walked again 2 months later, against all predictions. And when that happened, the whole town noticed. They called it a miracle, or a warning, or a gift from someone's ancestors. And in the records, those stories were written differently. Not in ink, in tone. They were told with reverence. Because for all the knives and tinctures and charmed rings tied with twine, healing was still a mystery. And mystery demanded respect. The stories people told about healing were rarely tidy. They didn't have beginnings or endings, just a slow winding through pain and patience, through heat and silence, through nights so long they forgot what came before them. And when a story did end, when someone finally stood up, finally ate, finally laughed again, it was retold with the kind of caution reserved for sacred things. Not bragging, not celebration. More like awe. Because recovery felt like a trick. Something the body did when no one was looking. Or maybe something the sickness allowed. In some traditions, it was believed that illnesses had personalities. That fever was a jealous spirit. That wasting diseases were ancient beings with long memories. That if you were rude to your sickness, if you cursed it, fought it too openly, it might dig in harder, refuse to leave. So instead, you had to speak softly, offer it comfort, acknowledge its presence, invite it to pass through, but never insist. You treated it like a guest you hadn't asked for but needed to show respect. That's why offerings were left beside the bed. A bowl of milk, a little bread, salt in the corners of the room, a knife under the pillow, not for use, but for symbolism. To show the illness it could be cut, if needed. To remind it that it wasn't the only one with power. These weren't superstitions, not really. They were negotiations. People negotiating with something they couldn't see. And those negotiations shaped everything about how the sick were treated. In some homes, no one was allowed to cry around the patient. It might signal weakness, invite death. In others, crying was required, loud, public wailing to scare away whatever spirits had taken hold. In some places, the room had to be hot. In others, freezing cold. Some healers whispered over the body. Others beat drums at its feet. And sometimes both worked, and sometimes neither did, because sickness didn't play by rules. It came when it wanted, left when it was done. And while it stayed, it rearranged the world around it. Whole families slept on floors so the sick could have the bed. Meals were skipped so broth could be made. Children learned to walk quietly. Neighbours brought what they could: honey, cloth, boiled water, left it at the door, and didn't ask questions. Because everyone knew it could be them next. Sickness didn't care about station. It came for the rich, the poor, the pious, the drunk, the kind, the cruel. And so, for a little while, everyone was equal, at least in fear, and sometimes in grace. Because while illness stripped people of power, it also drew things out of others. Gentleness, attention, care that might otherwise never have been spoken. There's an intimacy to washing someone who can't move, to holding a cup to their lips, to cleaning the sheets without comment, to singing softly when there's nothing else left to do. And in that intimacy, something quiet grows. Not love, always, but something adjacent. Recognition of mortality, of need, of how fragile we are, and how far we'll go to pretend we aren't. That's why so many healing traditions involved touch. Hands on the chest, on the temples, on the soles of the feet. Not always with medicine, just presence, just the warmth of one body reminding another that it's still here. And in some cultures, healing wasn't complete until that touch had happened. Until the healer had closed their eyes, breathed with the patient, and said, sometimes aloud, sometimes not, "You're not alone." Because even now, in the most modern hospitals, with the most advanced tools, people still reach for hands in the dark. Still want to be seen, still want to know someone is there, just in case they don't wake up. That want hasn't changed. It's as old as the first fever, the first wound, the first child who didn't stir, and the first parent who sat beside them, singing anyway. And when medicine doesn't have answers, which it often doesn't, that want becomes everything. It becomes the reason to keep trying, to boil one more root, to pray one more time, to stay up through the night, watching the rise and fall of breath like it's a tide you might be able to anchor with your eyes. Because hope is stubborn, even when the body isn't. Even when the healer is exhausted. Even when the patient says, "I'm ready to go." Hope stays, not because it's deluded, but because it's ancestral. Handed down like a recipe, a charm, a folded scrap of advice tucked behind a hearthstone. Don't stop until the second breath doesn't come. And so we don't. We sit, we stir, we hold, and sometimes, against all odds, the body stirs back. The fever cracks, the colour returns, and someone says your name like they remember it now, like it's a word made of sunlight. And when that happens, no one asks which cure worked. Was it the garlic, the leeches, the prayer, the clean linen? Doesn't matter. What matters is the body said yes, and the sickness, for whatever reason, let go. And for a moment, the world is whole again. Even if it won't stay that way. Even if another sickness waits just down the road. There is this breath, this moment, this return, and in it, all the strange, painful, beautiful history of medicine curls up quietly and sleeps. For now. There's a kind of silence that only comes after a body has come back from the edge. Not celebration, not relief, just stillness. As if no one dares speak too loud or move too fast for fear of inviting the sickness back. In the old days, when someone survived a deadly fever, the room was left untouched for days. The sheets weren't burned, the herbs weren't cleared. Even the dish that held the broth stayed where it was, crusted and cold, like an offering the gods had accepted. Superstition? Maybe, but more often it was gratitude wrapped in caution. Because you didn't question a victory, you respected it, and sometimes that meant pretending it hadn't happened at all. In many cultures, people believed that speaking too soon about recovery could undo it. The sickness might hear, might remember, might return. So instead they said things like, "She's resting better now," or "We'll see how tomorrow looks." Never, "She's healed." Never, "It's over." Not yet, because healing was fragile, easily startled, and in some cases incomplete. There were those who rose from their beds changed, slower, quieter, less whole, bodies that had lived through too much, minds that refused to return from wherever they'd gone during the worst of it. They were called touched, dream walkers, fever marked. Some were feared, others simply watched. And in some villages, a person who'd survived a near fatal illness wasn't allowed to handle newborns or milk cows until a full season had passed, just in case, just to be safe. The idea wasn't cruelty, it was acknowledgement that not all scars are visible, that some wounds leave their teeth in the soul, and the body, even as it lives, carries their echo. In ancient Rome, the philosopher Seneca wrote about this. He spoke of convalescence, not just as a return to health, but as a second birth. You weren't the same, you'd gone somewhere, and come back, and that return demanded gentleness, the slow reintroduction of foods, of light, of noise, even of joy, because joy too could overwhelm a body not yet steady. That's why so many recovery rituals were quiet. A bowl of broth placed without a word. A single flower in a clay cup beside the bed. A child allowed to sleep beside the mother again, but only once her breathing held steady through the night. Healing wasn't a switch, it was a path, and it required walking slowly back into the world. In some places the healed wore white for 7 days. In others, red string was tied around their wrist to protect the still fragile life pulsing underneath. In Japan, incense was burned each morning beside the patient's bed for a week after recovery, not for purification, but as thanks, a recognition of survival, a plea that the gods, or whatever force had spared them, would not feel forgotten. And in more than a few traditions, the first food eaten after recovery had to be shared, not out of scarcity, but because a life, once nearly lost, could not be held alone. It had to be witnessed, rejoined to the table, to the village, to the rhythm of waking and sleeping and working and laughing that makes up a life, because the sickness may have taken only the body for a while, but the spirit too had to be returned. This belief wasn't metaphorical, it was medicine. In Haitian Vodou, in certain African healing rites, in First Nations traditions, ceremonies were performed not just to expel illness, but to welcome the person back, to reintegrate them. The fire was lit, the drumming began, the names were spoken again, first by the family, then by the patient. And when that name was recognised, when the person stood up and said, "I am here," the healing was considered complete. Not before. Because in many places, the final part of recovery wasn't rest. It was recognition. To be seen, fully. To be claimed by the world again, after time spent outside of it. And even now, echoes of that remain. The first walk outside after an illness feels different. The air tastes sharper. The colours are too bright. You notice things. Stone, shadow, the sound of wind against glass, that never felt important before. That's not coincidence, that's return. And the body remembers how close it came to letting go, just in fact. And maybe that's why we cling to strange remedies, even now. Not because they work, but because they tether us. To the ones who came before. To the stories they left behind. To the hope that lives in every hot compress, every sip of broth, every soft breath whispered beside a sickbed. Hope, not as a cure, but as a companion, one that stays until we are strong enough to walk alone again. The first night back in your own bed always feels strange, even if the fever is gone, even if the coughing has stopped. The room is too quiet, the sheets too crisp, the ceiling too familiar, but slightly off, as if it tilted while you were away. You listen for sounds that aren't there anymore. The clink of the spoon in the broth bowl, the murmured prayers, the soft scrape of someone pacing beside your bed. But there's only silence. Not a frightening one, just empty, as if the sickness took more than your breath while it stayed. And in a way it did, because even when the body mends, it leaves behind a map, a trail of what it had to survive. Skin knits over wounds, yes, but it doesn't always forget where the blade went in. Scars bloom differently for different people. Some are visible. The line on the abdomen where the boil was drained. The dip in the skull where the trepanation was done. The missing finger. The uneven gait. But others are quieter. The panic when a cough lasts too long. The flinch at the smell of camphor. The dreams of drowning in sweat while no one answers your call. And in the old stories, these invisible scars were treated too, not with medicine, with ritual. In parts of rural Norway, it was said that after surviving a serious illness, a person had to walk a mile at dawn, barefoot, carrying salt in one hand and a piece of bread in the other. At the end of the walk, they'd feed the bread to a dog. If it accepted, the person was truly healed. If not, they had more resting to do. In medieval Germany, recovered patients were told to bathe in running water before returning to public life. It wasn't about cleanliness. It was about breaking the seal, washing away the shadow that clung to them. And in Ireland, there was the second name. A name whispered into the ear of the patient when they were thought near death. A name meant only for the soul, not for use in life. If the patient recovered, that second name was buried in silence, never spoken aloud, never written. It was said to confuse the spirits, to protect the person from being recognized again by death. Because once you'd been claimed, even briefly, you needed new armor. And sometimes that armour was made of silence. Sometimes it was made of stories. In many African and indigenous traditions, illness wasn't seen as random. It had cause. Maybe not a germ or a toxin, but an imbalance. A broken thread in the web of life. Maybe you'd forgotten a ritual. Maybe someone had spoken your name with bitterness. Maybe a spirit needed something only you could offer. And when the sickness passed, the healer didn't just treat your body. They asked questions. Who had you argued with? What did you dream? Where had your shadow been while your body lay still? And those answers were woven into the healing. You apologized. You sang. You made offerings. You went to the place in the forest where you'd first felt cold and left something behind. Bread, water, hair from your comb. You didn't ask why. You just did it. Because healing wasn't just a return to health. It was a reweaving of life. A way of saying, I've come back. I remember how to live. That part of medicine has faded in most places, but it hasn't disappeared. You can still see it in the way people redecorate after a long illness. They change the sheets, repaint the walls, burn candles for no reason, or they leave something untouched, an old glass of water, a pillow left on the couch, because it bore witness. And witnesses, in healing, matter. In the oldest traditions, healing couldn't be done alone. You needed someone to hold your feet while the herbs were poured, to count your breaths, to sing the chant, to carry the sickness for a few hours while you slept. In Andean medicine, they call it susto, the fright. A part of your soul knocked loose by illness or fear. And to bring it back, a ritual must be done. Not by the sick person alone, by someone who loves them. The soul needs calling. It needs invitation. And that belief, however old, isn't so far from modern medicine. Because even now, we say things like call them back when someone is unconscious. We sit by bedsides for hours. We speak to people who haven't opened their eyes in days. We read them their favourite books. We play their music. We press their hand and say, come back. I'm here. We call it comfort, but it's more than that. It's part of the cure. Because the body, for all its cells and systems and circuits, is still listening. It remembers voices. And sometimes those voices are what it follows home. The room doesn't smell like sickness anymore. It smells like something older. Wood warmed by the sun. Water left too long in a tin cup. The faint dust of linens that haven't been turned in days. The kind of smell that doesn't call attention to itself. It simply waits. The window is open, just a crack. Enough to let the breeze shift the edges of a curtain that's been tied back and untied again more times than anyone can count. Someone left a piece of bread on the bedside table. Not fresh, but not mouldy either. It's the kind of thing no one wants to throw away, even though no one will eat it. It's not an offering. Not exactly. But it's close. Because healing, when it finally comes, never looks the way people expect it to. It's not triumphant. It doesn't knock on the door and enter like a herald. It seeps in, like warmth creeping back into fingers, like light that softens before it brightens, like a breath you didn't notice you were holding finally letting go. And when it happens, when it really happens, it takes a while to believe it. That's why, across centuries, across continents, across languages and beliefs, people marked recovery in ways that looked less like celebration and more like ritual. In some parts of the Balkans, it was tradition for the recovered to leave their pillow outside overnight on the 7th day. Not to dry, not to clean, but to let the spirits know they'd moved on, that they didn't need tending anymore, that whatever had come to visit could move on too. And in some parts of northern India, the shadow of the patient was measured each morning during convalescence. If it fell short, the soul hadn't fully returned. If it was sharp and long and clean, then it was time to bathe, to eat something fried, to speak your full name again. Because the name, too, needed returning. You might have heard it 100 times during your illness, but that wasn't the same. The healer might have whispered it. Your mother might have pleaded with it. The priest might have written it in chalk beside your door. But none of that counted until you said it, with your own breath, from your own mouth, in your own voice. I am here. I am back. Even if it wasn't all the way true yet, because healing, in the end, is not perfection. It's not a full reset, not a clean slate. It's a reckoning. You carry what happened with you. Not like a chain, not like a punishment. More like a shadow that now walks beside you in daylight, just faint enough that no one else can see it. But you know it's there. And you treat it with respect. That's what the old ones did. In cultures where scars were marked in ceremony, people would anoint the healed body with oil, frankincense, myrrh, pine tar, bear fat, depending on the region. Not for medicine, for memory. To remind the skin that it had done something hard. And lived. In some places, the healed would place their hands on the sick. Just for a moment. Not to give advice. Not to say, you'll be fine. But to pass something else. Something quieter. The understanding of what it's like. What it means to lie in the half-darkness for days. To measure time in spoons and sips. To hear your name and not be sure if it's meant for this world or another. And to still be here. Still coughing maybe. Still sore. Still unsure of how long this peace will last. But here. And for the people who never made it through. Who were buried with coins on their eyelids or wrapped in sheets soaked with rosemary and tears. There were stories. Told not just in grief, but in honour. In remembrance. In the slow recognition that to be part of a community meant to carry the names of the gone in your mouth like charms. You lit candles for them. You wrote their initials on door frames. You remembered how they liked their tea. And in doing so, you kept the story of their body's fight alive. Because death, too, was part of medicine. Not its failure, its frontier. The thing that came not because we did something wrong, but because everything has its season. And the healer, if they were wise, did not fight it. They sat beside it, held the hand of the dying, wrapped the feet in warm cloth, closed the eyes with reverence, and said, without fear, "Well done." Because sometimes healing is what happens to the ones who stay, and the leaving is not a defeat, it is a return to something older than pain, older than sickness, older than breath itself. There's no clock ticking in the room, but time moves anyway. You can feel it in the slant of the light across the floorboards, in the way the dust has stopped rising when people walk through, in the quiet confidence of the air that nothing sudden is going to happen now, not tonight. The bed's been changed, not freshly, not recently, but enough. The last of the camphore's gone from the pillow. Someone's opened the window just a little wider, let the wind finish what the medicine started. There's a teacup on the windowsill, not steaming, not cold, just there. Still half full, like it was placed in a hurry and then forgotten. Or maybe remembered and left on purpose. As if to say, this is what survival looks like. Half sipped, half finished, still warm enough to matter. You're not the same, of course. No one ever is, after. After the sweats, the prayers, the pale moons of fingernails pressed against fevered sheets. After the strange dreams. After the hands at your back, holding you up to drink. After the silence that waited too long between breaths. But the body does what it does. It adapts. It learns. It weaves scar into skin like thread through cloth and makes it part of the pattern. Not a flaw, just a feature. A place where something once happened. A place that remembers, even after everyone else forgets. And they will forget, not cruelly, just naturally. They'll stop asking how you're feeling. They'll stop lowering their voices when they see you. They'll stop measuring your steps as you pass, looking for signs. And that too is healing, because it means you've returned, fully, to the rhythm of days that don't revolve around thermometers or tinctures, to the world of errands and sunlight and shoes that press just slightly too tight, to the little complaints, the ones that mean nothing, unless you've been in a room where everything meant too much. You'll return to those complaints, to noise, to appetite, to irritation, to laughter that doesn't start with coughing. And when you do, you'll carry something with you, not heavy, but real. A quiet knowledge, a deeper kindness. Not the kind you have to show, just the kind that sharpens your listening, that softens the way you stand near someone who looks tired, that makes you a little more patient in lines, that teaches you how to notice when someone else is walking slower than they used to, because you'll recognize that pace. You'll know what it means, and maybe you won't say anything. You won't have to. You'll just walk beside them a little longer. Open a door. Let the silence linger an extra beat before you ask the next question. Because you've been there, and you remember how much noise the world can make when you've just come back to it. That's the final medicine. Not the cure, not the rest, not even the ritual, but the carrying forward of gentleness. The permission it gives others to pause, to take a slower breath, to stop pretending that healing is something that happens all at once. Because it doesn't. It never has, and it never will, but it does happen. One breath at a time. One sip. One softened word. One more sunrise than you thought you'd get. And maybe you wake up tomorrow with a sore throat again, or a chill, or the ache that never really left your knees. But you'll know the way back now. You'll know which herbs helped, which chair caught the light just right in the morning, which song helped you sleep, which memory you held on to when the night stretched too long. You'll know how to ask for help a little sooner, and maybe, just maybe, you'll know how to offer it without asking anything in return. Because someone did that for you a long time ago, or maybe last week, doesn't matter. The memory is in you now, like medicine, like muscle, like breath. And if you ever find yourself again lying in a room that smells of boiled linen and old tea, staring up at a ceiling that forgot how to offer comfort, you'll remember this. It passes. It always passes. Not easily, not quickly, but like a storm over old stones. The stones stay. The sky clears. And in the stillness after, something ancient and true begins to stir. Not strength. Not yet, but readiness. And then, a hand, a light, a step, the story continuing, quiet as breath.